Managing asynchronous state in a React application can sometimes be more problematic than expected. Tanstack Query, formerly known as React Query, is a great library that helps make this process much, much easier. This video is intended to give you an overview of how to set up and use Tanstack Query in a NextJS 13 application. This isn't meant to be a full code-along video, but I'll walk through the process of setting up a majority of the functionality of this application, so hopefully after watching, you have a great starting point to implement Tanstack in your own applications. We'll be going over how to set up both of these components, to fetch all of our data, to add a new to-do. We'll show the process of creating a spinner and disabling an input when something is loading. Our toast pop-up, our new to-do has been fetched. We update the status with disabling the buttons. We see the crossout with another toast notification, and we can delete a task as well. So let's go to the Tanstack website, tanstack.com. You can see here we've got a number of different things that they provide for us. What we're going to be working with is Tanstack Query. So let's go ahead and click on that. We're greeted with another page here with a bunch of stuff, but let's click the Get Started button. The documentation here is definitely worth reading. It gives you a lot of good information on the how and the why of Tanstack Query. We're going to do kind of a simplified demo today, running through and building out a to-do application. I made another video that I'll link up top that just goes over that same to-do application and just explains why we want to use Tanstack Query and what kind of problems it helps us solve. If you're interested in watching through that before watching this video, go ahead, we'll link it up top. But you can see on the Tanstack site, they kind of give us an example of this, which might up top seem confusing because it's all kind of just in one big code block, right? But we'll walk through the process of setting this up specifically in Next.js 13. So if we go through installation, you can see we've got npm i tanstack/react query. So in your code editor, npm i @tanstack/react query. I'm not going to run that because I already do have the dependency installed. If you're using pnpm or yarn, you've got those options as well. And then one other thing that we're going to be adding here is they do have devtools. So we do want to take a look at devtools and get the same thing, npm i @tanstack/react query devtools, load that up. And again, I've got that already pre-installed, so we're not going to do that. But devtools are going to be really useful to help us see what's happening when it comes to query functions, which we'll get into in a little bit. So I'm working in a Next.js 13 application here. And the first thing we're going to want to do after we install Tanstack is we're going to want to set up our providers. So Tanstack does utilize context to provide data throughout the entire application. So we're going to go ahead and set that up. So I've got a providers folder under my components. Let's add a new file. We're going to call this Tanstack provider.tsx. Now, if we go back through the documentation here in the quick start guide, you can see they give us a little bit of setup here, right? I'm actually going to differ a little bit from what this indicates, and I'll speak to that in just a minute. So here, since we are using context, we're going to have to declare this as a use client, as a client component. So we're going to import a couple things. We're going to import our query client provider from Tanstack React Query and query client. We'll also import from React Query DevTools, we're going to import React Query DevTools. And the only other thing we're going to import here is useState. So we're going to set up our component, our provider component here, const, we'll call it Tanstack provider equals, and it's going to be a function, right? And we'll have our return with whatever that's going to be, and we'll export default Tanstack provider. In the return, we're going to return our query client provider, and within that, we're going to put children, right? So React children, if you're not familiar with how this works, whenever you have a component in React and you've got your opening and closing brackets, if you put something between those opening and closing brackets, those are children. So we're going to import that prop, which we're going to call children. And children is going to be typed, I'm using TypeScript here, react.react node. If you're not using TypeScript, don't worry about this if you're just in JavaScript. So query client provider does take a prop, which is called client. We haven't set that up yet. And this is where I'm going to differ from the documentation a little bit. So if we look back at our documentation, we see they indicate const query client equals new query client in brackets, right? That's one of the things we've imported. And that is what they're sending in as that client prop. I'm going to differ a little bit. We're going to actually put this into state. When I've done this process, I've seen a lot of disconnects in how React Query is tracking the query functions, which is really a big deal. Query functions help us manage state that we're pulling down with React Query and refreshing that state. So like if it loses connection, it's not going to work correctly. So you can try this method. That's a reason why we're installing the devtools. If you see disconnects or disappearing state, which I'll point out again later, then you might want to try this method that I'm going to go over. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const query client equals use state. And that's going to take in a function new query client. All right. And now here we can put our query client. To save that, we get a little bit of a difference in formatting. And one thing I'm forgetting here is so I'll change this formatting again, is we do want to put in our React DevTools. So here we can put React Query DevTools, and we can close that out. There are some props, so we're going to put one prop. Initial is open. We're going to put that as false. So basically what that's going to do for us is we'll see a little symbol on the bottom of our screen that we can click on to open up a DevTools view. It's not going to just be open automatically. Now we'll save. Now we'll have a nice little better formatting. And there we go. That is our provider set up and ready to go. So now we need to actually put this provider so it can give all that data to our entire application. So in Next.js 13, we have this layout file. Layout file is basically where everything lives, right? So this one looks a little bit messy right now because I do have a bunch of other stuff here going already. I've got a toaster component from ShadCN UI. I've got a theme provider going on here, and I've got some session provider stuff from Auth.js. So we're not going to go through the process of setting all that other stuff up in this particular video. This is really just centered on Tanstack and working with Tanstack. If you're interested in some of that other stuff, let me know and I can put that together as well. So now that we're here, we're going to import our Tanstack provider that we just created from our providers component. And then from that point, we'll just wrap it around our children, right? That's already going to be here in your layout file when you make a Next 13 project. Tanstack provider. Let's get our closing tag and put it in the right position at the bottom. Okay. So as long as we have this wrapping around our children is going to be any pages that you render throughout navigation. So we're basically anything within your app and any components within those pages. So now that that's there, we're going to have access to Tanstack and our caching layer. And you can see here, this is our main page that we're going to be loading upon application load. We don't really have anything going on here right now. You can see we're calling getAuthSession, which is a custom function that I'm just outputting from NextAuth, basically just in this server component, because we don't have the use client directive at the top. So this is a React server component. This is just checking our user session to see if a session exists. If not, we're just going to return a sign in to see tasks. And if it does exist, we'll return some other stuff that we're going to work on together. Let's go ahead and let's start with one thing. We'll start with the to-dos section. Our to-dos component is what's going to actually call out and fetch that data for us. So in components, let's add a new file, and we will call this to-dos.tsx. We're going to make this a client component, right? Anything with Tanstack is going to be client side. You're not going to use this in any server components. So first we'll set up our basic thing. Const to-dos is a function. Export default to-dos. And what are we going to do here? Well, basically in this function, in this component, we want to have the component fetch data for to-dos. And then we want to render those to-dos, right? We want to do a couple other things too. We want to indicate to the user if this process is loading, we want to render that. And if we hit an error, we'll render some kind of message, right? So the first thing let's do is let's just build out a div here because we know this thing's going to live in some kind of container. I'm going to add some Tailwind styling here. And then we're going to end up mapping through to-do data here. We're going to run through the process of setting up our first React Query data fetch. So one thing that I'm just going to import right now, which you'll hopefully know the shape of your data, I'm going to just import this interface called to-do. When we call out to the back end, this is the information we're going to get back for each of the to-dos we receive. So I just want to have that there. So we'll import use query from Tanstack query. I also want to import Axios. So I'm going to use Axios to do this. You can use fetch. Fetch isn't going to throw an error. Axios will throw an error if it receives a status that isn't 200. So if you're using fetch, you have to throw your own error. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. And eventually we're going to make a to-do card just to display this data on the screen, but we'll worry about that in a little bit. So let's make our actual query to our backend. So let's go look real quick what's happening in the backend, just so we understand. Nothing too crazy. Again, this is just kind of a basic example app. We're checking a user session. If we don't have a session, we're going to throw a 401 status. If we do have a session, we're just going to query our database. We're using Prisma here. We're just going to find whatever to-dos are associated with the user ID that we have stored in the session. And then we're going to send those to-dos back. Nothing too crazy. We'll take a look at what those look like in just a minute. We are going to say const, and we're going to put some brackets there for now. And we're going to do use query, which is a function or a hook. And we pass in an object. Now within this object, we've got a number of things that we're going to pass in. The first thing I'm going to do is pass in what's called a query key. And you can see I've got some pop-ups here. Now a query key is what's going to help us establish this caching layer. It's what's going to help us say from other components in our application, hey, to-dos component, our data, because we have taken an action that mutated data on our database, our data that we already have on the front end is no longer valid. Process this thing again, do a refetch for us, go get that data, and let's update everything we've got going on. So query key, if you read through the documentation, it's an array, which you can put some kind of string, which we're going to just do user to-dos here. But you can also throw some extra information here, like you can throw objects in here. And if you needed like some specifics, like user ID is a specific ID, maybe you want to have something else in there as a requirement, whatever that information might be. These don't matter in the order that you put them in. So you can put these objects in any order, but we're just going to keep this simple and just stick with user to-dos right now. So since this is an object, we're going to throw a comma after this. And now we're going to put in our query function. So this takes in a function, which we're going to make this an async function, right? Because we know we're going to use Axios to call out to our backend to get some data. And we're going to do a couple things here. First things first is we're going to const destructured data from Axios. We'll do await axios.get. And then we'll throw in our API/todos/fetch, which just is our API endpoint that's going to run the processes we just looked at. Let's console.log what that data looks like so we can take a look at this stuff first. What we'll do is we'll go back to our main page here and we will import to-dos. We'll go ahead and just open that up and we'll save that. And let's npm run dev so we can start our server and we can look at what we actually get back before we do anything else with it. Okay, so you can see right now we don't have a session, so it does say sign in to see tasks, so that part's working out correctly for us. Now that we've signed in, we have our my to-dos output here, and which is right now it just says map through to-do data, right? Because we just kind of threw that incorrect comment in there, but that's okay. Since our component should be loading here, here's our map through to-do data, right? We should have something in the console here on our client component. We can see we get an object. Oops, let's go back. And here's our to-dos, right? And here's an array of to-dos. I've already got one thing in there, so we can see that this just matches up with that interface. We've got an ID, we've got completed, we've got created at all this stuff, right? So we get an array of to-dos in this object. So rather than just what we would be doing here is we need to return something from this function. Otherwise, nothing's going to go anywhere. So we're going to return data.todos, which we saw was that array. And we're going to just say this is as to-do array, just so we can use TypeScript and get some of that information back from the data that we're storing here. Before we take another step, I do want to note again, as I indicated earlier, if you're not using Axios, if you're using fetch, I believe fetch has that like .ok part of it, right? Where you would say like if something is not okay, which means you get an error back technically, then in that case you would throw new error, however you want to handle that error, and that's going to allow us to understand that there was an error in the fetch process. Just a note, in case you're using fetch or some other library to make your call that doesn't automatically throw an error like that. Okay, so now we're going to destructure some stuff from useQuery. We're going to destructure data, which is, in this case, whatever we're returning from this call, we're going to destructure is loading. And you can see I'm getting some suggestions here. I can hit Control Space, and I get a bunch of pop-ups here for all the things that we can destructure from here. The only other one I want to use today is error. So data, which we will put down here for now, and we'll do this. We're going to do json.stringify data null2, just so we can see the data on the screen for a moment. And the other things that we're going to do is we're going to do some conditional returns. We talked about this. We have if loading, render a loading message. All right, so we've got is loading. So we'll say if is loading, because this is going to be a Boolean value for us. Then we're just going to return a div. We're not even going to style this. We'll just say loading tasks. And if is error, we should handle errors a little bit better than this, but we're just going to say there was an error, try again, okay? All right, we're saving this. We can see we get loading tasks right away as we're loading. And there you go. There's our ugly little task displaying for us with our json.stringify. So cool. We are well on our way, and we know we already got our fetch happening. No use effect, no anything like that. All thanks to useQuery. So now let's pretty this up a little bit, and let's make some to-do cards just so we can display this data in a nicer format. So let's go back to our components, make a new file, and we're going to say to-do card.tsx. Set up our functional component just like we did before. Do card, it's a function. All right, and our return is something card, right? So let's make these basic for right now. To save ourselves a little bit of time, I'm going to just throw some imports in here that I already have. These are going to end up being client components. So let's do the use client directive at the top. And we're going to import a bunch of stuff that I have here from a UI library called shadcn. We can see I've got a UI folder that has a whole bunch of stuff in it. We're also going to import a button from shadcn. So let's make this card component. We're going to build out a card, and we have a card header. And in that header, we have a card title. In our card title, we're going to put in a title. We'll take care of props in a little bit. And I want to add some styling because we do see here that we have a completed attribute on this. And right now that specific to do is false, right? So we're going to do some tailwind styling here and just say, if we have completed is true, then we're going to do a line through. Otherwise, don't do anything. That's our ternary operator there. And again, I've got these squiggly red lines because I'm not importing any of these props yet. And then I'm not doing any kind of card body, even though I've got some of the stuff up here. We're just going to do a card footer. And for now, we'll put these two buttons we're going to render in a div with some basic styling. We're going to do flex, justify, between, and min width full. These buttons are going to be, we'll change these in a little bit. This is going to be update status, and this is going to be delete. So I want to take care of these props because this is kind of bothering me. So what are our props going to be here? Well, we have our interface already from this to do. I've already got an export on here, export interface to do. So let's go back into our card here, and we'll do import type to do from our to-dos component. We're going to destructure from our type to do. And if I hit Control Space now, I can see all the stuff that TypeScript is giving me here. So we're going to use completed. We know we want that. We're going to use the title. And at some point, we're also going to end up using ID in the future here. So let's take that in right now as well. And now my completed and my title don't have a squiggly line on there anymore. And we can see what those things are. That's a Boolean. This is a string. And we're set. Let's go ahead, save everything we've got so far. Let's go back to our to-dos where we are fetching. And we'll import to-do card that we just made. And now instead of this JSON.stringify, now this is where we're actually going to map through our data. All right, so let's get rid of all this stuff. So let's map through our data. So we have data, which we have destructured from our useQuery function, .map. And we know that this is going to take, well, let's call this a to-do, right? And then for each to-do, we're going to render out our to-do card. And we know that we take in props. Now we could do this completed equals completed, whatever, but I'm just going to destructure to-do. Oops. This might yell at me. Let's see. No, okay. So even though I'm not actually using all of the attributes from the to-do object that we have that we're putting in here, we're just spreading everything that we get in to-do. So all of these things. This is the equivalent of saying like completed equals to-do dot completed and all of the other things that are contained within this. So instead, we're just spreading that out to make that nice and clean. Let's save that. If I didn't mess anything up, this should adjust now into our to-do card. There we go. So now we see our little card set up. First task for today. We've got an update status button. We've got a delete button, and these aren't doing anything quite yet. We'll fix those up in a little bit. Let's move on. Let's give ourselves the ability to add a new to-do. So in components, new file, and we'll say make to-do.tsx. Same thing we've done with everything else here. Set this up, and we know we're going to have some kind of return in here, right? So we know up front this is going to be a client component. So in Next.js 13, we do need to put use client at the top. And in return, we want to have an input, and we want to have a button to submit. So we're going to do a couple things here. We're going to import. I've got input from my shadcn components. I've got import button like we did from the other one from my shadcn components. Let's also import now Axios, because we know we're going to use Axios, because if we're going to make a new to-do to send to our backend, we're going to use Axios to do that. And let's do a couple other things. We're going to import useToast from shadcn as well. We need useState. We're going to need state for the input itself. I can tell you we're going to need some extra imports here from React Query, but we'll hold off on doing that just for the moment, just so we can make our actual component here, right? So let's wrap this thing in a div, because we know we're going to have an input here, and which is self-closing. I don't need that. And we know we're going to have a button that's going to say submit or something like that, right? On our div, let's add some styling. We're going to do flex gap2 min width full, just so it just takes up the whole width of this container that we have going on this thing. And I want to put a couple things in the input here. We're going to have a placeholder here. We'll just say to do. We're going to put the value. We know we need that here. We'll fill that out in just a second. We know we're going to need something on change here. So we'll fill that out in a second as well. We'll stop there for the moment. So let's set up the state for this input button. So we'll do const. We'll just say input and set input equals use state. And we'll just set that as an empty string for now. So this will be the input. And this will do on change is a function. Or set input is e.target.value. And I'll throw the E in here. Oops, so we have that event. So let's just go ahead and put this back into our page. Let's import make to-dos from make to-do and throw that in there just to see that we've actually got it. And there we go. Here's our to-do input with a submit button. Great. So let's go back and let's actually make this do some stuff that we want to do. So we're going to import two things now. We're going to import use mutation from React Query. And we're going to import use query client. The one thing I want to set up first is our query client. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. Const query client equals use query client. That's our function. So this is a function that we've imported. This is what we're going to call. So now we can call different methods on query client. So what's going to happen here? Well, we're going to type into this input. We're going to type some kind of task, whatever our task is. And then when we hit submit, we just want to send that data to our backend. If we go look at this create route that we have going on here, nothing too crazy. We check for a session, then we take our body, we store it into a body variable. I'm using Zod to parse the stuff we're sending in here, which is just good practice, and you validate your data that way. We're going to pull the to-do, which is a string from that, and then we find the user session or find the user by session. And if we can't find the user in our database, we return an error on that. Should be there because when we do sign up, we automatically create that user, but okay. And then we make a to-dos.create. We send in the title and the user ID is the session that we found. So now that we're back in make to-dos, we know we just basically want to send over whatever the value of this input is, right? So we're going to do the same thing we did last time. We're going to do const, and we know we're going to destructure some stuff from use mutation, which is a function or a hook, use hook. It takes in an object with a bunch of different things. The first thing we're going to put here is our mutation function. Now, just like the other query function that we did, this is going to be an async function. And here, the only thing we need to do is await axios.post. We'll use our API /todos/create endpoint, and we'll send in an object, which is our data, and it expects it to be called to do. And we know that's going to be our input value. That's it. That's our mutation function. That's our post call. That's all we need to do for that. This is an object, so we'll put a comma at the end here before our next thing. So now if I hit control space here, again, you see a bunch of the things we have access to. On success is one that we care about, and on error. So we're going to do on success, which again is a function. And we're going to do a couple different things here. The first thing I want to do, which I actually didn't do yet, is since we're using a toast notification system from shadcn, I need to do this, const toast equals use toast. That's the function that we've imported here. And then within this on success function, the first thing I want to do is throw a toast notification, assuming we have success, just that says this takes a object description to do added successfully, an exclamation mark at the end of that. The next thing we want to do is we want to take this to do input and we want to blank that out. So we'll do set input back to an empty string. And now what we're going to do, since we've got this query client, we're going to do query client dot. And you can see we get a bunch of stuff in here as well, right? The thing that we are going to be caring about is invalidate queries. So this is the function, and we can just throw our array right in here, and we called this user to-dos, right? That was the same thing we had in the to-dos component. We put this query key in as user to-dos. So what is this doing for us? As soon as we get a success back from Axios, a 200 status, this function is going to run. It's going to pop up with our toast notification that says to do edit successfully. It's going to set our input back to an empty string, and then we call query client.invalidate queries with the user to-dos array, telling Tanstack, hey, that data that we have stored in that user to-dos layer is no longer valid. So wherever we're calling that, which is in our to-dos component, run this query function again and pull down the new data. We'll test that in a second to make sure that works. The other thing we're going to do here is on error. And again, that's a function. And if we hit an error, I just want to do toast with a description of, for now, we're just going to do something went wrong. Please try again. I can also put in this object a variant, and we can call this destructive. So it's a different color. It's a nice red color for us. That's great. So we've got some stuff here set up and ready to go for us, but we didn't actually destructure anything from this use mutation function. So what we're going to pull from that is what's called mutate. You can just leave this as mutate. That's going to be the actual mutation function that we've requested to run here. I'm going to call this something different. I like calling them something a little more substantial. We'll call that submit. You can call it submit to do if you really want to. And then we're going to also destructure is loading. So again, if I do control space, you can see I get a bunch of stuff here. The most simplistic case here that we can do is just our function and is loading. So we already know our input has our value and our on change. Now our button's going to do some stuff here. Our button, when we have our on click, because we know we're going to submit this thing, it's a function. And we're going to call, what do we call it? Submit to do. Right? That's that. The other things we're going to do here is in this button component, I have actually modified the shadcn button to accept an is loading prop. So I'm going to pass that in here. just to make this nice and pretty. So when we have an is loading, if it's loading, a spinner shows up on the button. So I've got is loading. So I'm going to pass in our is loading variable. And I'm also going to pass that into disabled as well, just so we disable that button while this process is loading. And under input, we can also disable that input while this process is loading. Let's save everything that we have here. Hopefully I did this all correctly in one shot. Let's say our new task is here. And let's click the submit button. We see our little loading spinner. We see we've disabled this, so we know the is loading Boolean is working for us. There's our toast notification, to do added successfully, and now here's our new task. So we know that our to do component has refetched that data for us and updated our data, right? We didn't use state, which we would have needed to do in a use effect, so that would re-render correctly. Everything's just working, and this is so clean, and we don't have to elevate state. We don't have to do any kind of hacky solutions with use effect. It just works so well. Okay, that's great. I love what I'm seeing so far. Let's talk about this little thing we haven't really touched upon yet, which is our React query devtools. So if we open this up, you can see we've got user to-dos here. That's that query key that we have listed previously in our query function. And you can see that this is stale. React query, I'm not going to go through this on this specific example, but you can set the amount of time that something is considered valid for or fresh for your data. With React query, basically, as soon as it pulls this by default, as soon as it pulls down that data, it's going to consider it stale. In most cases, that's probably okay, but you might have something where you just want that data to stay longer valid for a longer period of time, regardless of what else is going on. Another fun feature about React query is if your user navigates away from the page. So all I did was click on our code over here, and then we click back. Did you see that? How that switched to fetching? So if your user is switching tabs, there is a possibility that whatever data you were pulling down from your database, when they come back to that tab, is no longer valid. React query handles that for us automatically, just navigating away from a tab and navigating back and refetching that data. What a wonderful thing to not have to worry about. You can test these things yourself. You can click refetch, you can click invalidate and all this other stuff. But this is just, and here is kind of your data that exists in your caching layer. If you have multiple query functions going on with different query keys, you'll see them listed out here. Again, like I stated up top when we were setting up the provider, if you see this like flash out at some point and disappear, maybe you're using that const method instead of the use state method in your provider. Try one or the other and see which one works best for you. I recommend the use state, especially if you're using Next 13. That's what I'm familiar with, and that's where I've seen this most effective. All right, we're done with that for now. Let's move on. Hello, Eric from the future here. While editing, I realized there's something else I really should have covered for you all. When you're handling errors from your calls, like I did note before, Axios is going to throw an error automatically on an error status. If you're using another library, you might need to use the throw new error process there. You can actually pass in your error here. We're just going to type this as any for right now. Typically, if you're looking at your error, you might have like error.response.status is typically what you're going to see. So you can actually give more meaningful notifications to your end users. If you do something like if error.response.status is equal to, is equal to 401, then you can do a toast notification for, like user not found or whatever you're trying to indicate based on whatever your responses are from your backend. So just a quick extra note there on that you do have access to the error object. We're going to make this use status and delete button work as well. And honestly, it's the same exact thing that we just did over here with this use mutation. We're just going to do it again in the card component. So we'll navigate back to to-do card. Honestly, if you wanted to, you could make these buttons their own components. I'm going to refrain from doing that just because I don't think it's necessary in this specific use case. But if you wanted an update status button or something similar in various parts of your application that did the same kind of process and still needed to rerun that same query, again, you can make it its own component and just plug it in wherever it needs to be. So now that we're back at to-do card, there's a couple other things we're going to want to import here. We'll do them right at the top. We're going to import use toast again, just like we had in the other component. And we're going to import Axios because we know we're going to need that again. Use mutation once again. and use query client, just like we did last time. So we've got the stuff here we need, and we're going to move down a little bit. We're going to set up our toast with use toast. Again, from shadcn, if you're not familiar with that library, I'll try to make sure I put a link below in the description. It's a phenomenal library. Please go use it. It makes this stuff a lot nicer, and you could develop a lot more quickly. And we'll do const query client equals use query client. There we go. We've got these buttons that don't do anything yet, but let's go ahead and set up what those functions are going to be. So let's do the delete one first, I guess. Why not? On our backend, we won't look at it. All we're going to do is send it a ID number, which is what we have an ID number for each of these tasks. So we're going to do const equals use mutation function object in there. Same thing we did last time. Mutation function. It's an async function. And in this case, we're going to do await axios.post link to our API endpoint to do /delete in this case. And we're going to send it some data. It expects an ID. We're going to send it the ID, comma, because we're in an object here. Then we have our onSuccess call. Again, it expects a function. So onSuccess, we'll do what we did last time. We're going to put a toast notification pop up with a description that just says task deleted, because we're deleting the task in this particular case. And then we're going to do exactly what we did last time, our query client dot invalidate queries, which is a function, takes in our user to-dos string inside that array. And then we have our onError, which is a function, another toast with the description. There was an error, please try again. And we'll throw in, as well as that string, a variant, which will be destructive. So we've got the setup. Let's see structure. So again, this is mutate, which we're going to call delete task. And then we also have is loading. Now I'm going to name this right now, because since we're going to have two of these in here, we'll have two different is loadings. And let's just call this delete loading. And that's it for right now. So let's go down to our delete button. We'll adjust our onClick handler here to a function. And this is going to be our delete task function that we call. And we have some other stuff here where we can do is loading. We looked at this before. And we're going to do delete loading. And then disabled, for now, we're just going to put delete loading here as well. And let's save this and let's make sure that this works for us. So here we have our new task. I'm going to click the delete button. We see our spinner. There was an error. Please try again. Let's hit that one more time. I think something may have just been going on with NextJS loading. We hit delete. There we go. Task deleted. But we did see an error message, so we know that that error message works for us as well, right? Something went wrong on our back end. There was a miscommunication in the server, whatever. We saw that error message pop up correctly. I was gonna just go through and change my back end and force an error out for us, but lucky enough, we just saw that process. So great, task deleted. We're good to go. We know deleting works. Let's do this update status. To save ourselves some time, I'm gonna copy everything here that we just did, and we're gonna make some changes here. Instead of this called delete task, we'll call this update task. And then we'll call this update loading. And instead of going to a delete backend, we're actually going to go to a status backend. And here we're going to send in the ID, but we're also going to send in completed, whatever the current state of that task is. And then here we'll say task updated. Say task status updated. Same thing, query client dot invalidate queries, refetch that data for us. And on error, something went wrong, right? So we'll make the same changes to this update status button. So on click handler function. This one is now our update task function. Is loading is our update loading Boolean that we destructured. And for disabled now, let's make an update here. Let's do update loading or delete loading, right? That way, regardless of what button you're clicking, and we'll update this one as well, both of those buttons will just become disabled. So you can't click update and delete and have both trying to be called at the same time. I think If I didn't miss anything through that copy and updates process, I believe now, we can clear that. I believe if I click update status, we see both of them now go disabled. We have our spinner here because that's the one that's actually loading. Task status updated, and now we see our strike through from our ternary operator here for our tailwind styling on our title. There we go. Hopefully this has been a good overview of how to set up Tanstack query in a Next.js 13 application, how to utilize the use query functions and the mutate functions, the use query hooks and the use mutation hook. And hopefully this helps you write cleaner, more concise components in your React applications and makes hopefully the process of managing asynchronous state a much more enjoyable developer experience. If I missed anything or if you have any corrections for me, please feel free to comment below. If you appreciate this video and think it's helpful, please go ahead and share it with folks that you know and help spread the word here. Thank you very much for tuning in.